They mocked the royal guard's old tunic, called it shabby, said he didn't belong with the rest of them, claimed his patch was unauthorized, and his silence was insubordination. But the guard didn't flinch. He just stood there, still, like he had for decades. And when the general's car pulled up minutes later, no one expected him to stop. But he did. Not for the ceremony, not for the salute. He stopped cold, because he'd seen that patch before, once, years ago, in a place no one ever talks about. Before we reveal what that patch meant, hit that subscribe button and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Morning broke grey over Buckingham Palace, the kind of London sky that can't decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to. The air held that crisp October bite that makes tourists pull their scarves tighter while they shuffle into position behind the ceremonial ropes. By 8:30, the crowd was already 3 deep. Families from Germany pointing excitedly at the palace gates, their children clutching miniature Union Jack flags bought from street vendors. American tourists in matching London 2024 sweatshirts clutched paper cups of tea from the corner vendor, steam rising in the cool air as they practiced their best British accents. Japanese visitors with cameras that cost more than most people's monthly salary waited, with the infinite patience of those who understood that the perfect shot required perfect timing. French students on a school trip huddled together, their teacher explaining in rapid whispers about the historical significance of what they were witnessing. An elderly Australian couple shared a thermos of coffee, the man's veteran's cap suggesting he understood military bearing better than most. A family from Mumbai kept their young son entertained with whispered stories about brave soldiers, while he stared wide-eyed at the spectacle before him. Kids pressed against the barriers, eyes wide with wonder, whispering about the tall soldiers in their brilliant red coats and massive bearskin hats. Some waved enthusiastically, convinced they could make the guards smile. Others stood in perfect stillness themselves, trying to copy the soldiers' discipline. Parents held phones ready, coaching their children on where to stand, when to smile, how to get the best angle with the palace in the background. Everyone knew the drill by now. These guards don't move, don't speak, don't even blink. But today, something was different. At the far left of the ceremonial line stood Lance Corporal Malcolm Granger. 57 years old, weathered face carved from granite, shoulders that had carried more than ceremonial rifles in places most people couldn't pronounce. There was something different about the way he held himself, not the rigid perfection of parade ground training, but the relaxed alertness of someone who'd learned that survival often depends on staying calm while staying ready. His hands, visible through the regulation white gloves, showed the calluses that come from real fieldwork. The way he breathed, slow, controlled, economical, suggested someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. Even his stillness was different from the younger guards. Theirs was concentrated effort, the kind that requires constant mental discipline. His was natural, automatic, the way a tree stands still in the wind. To most tourists walking past, he looked exactly like every other guard. Red tunic, white gloves, boots polished to mirror shine, rifle held at the perfect angle. But there were signs, if you knew how to read them. The way his eyes swept the crowd in subtle arcs, never lingering but always assessing. The slight favour he showed his left leg, suggesting an old injury that had healed but left its mark. The economy of his movements, no wasted motion, everything purposeful. Except his tunic wasn't quite the same bright crimson as the others. The red was there, sure, but it had that slightly faded quality you only get from years of actual service. Real service. The kind that happens in places where uniforms get dirty and sometimes don't come home. The brass buttons were polished to regulation standard, but they'd lost that mirror gleam the younger guards maintained through careful nightly buffing. The fabric had tiny pulls and mends that spoke of campaigns and care. And if you knew where to look, really knew what you were looking for, you could spot something else. On the inner edge of his left sleeve, barely visible unless you were standing close and at the right angle, was a small patch. Not the standard regimental insignia that every guard wore. This was different. Hand-stitched, with thread that had faded from deep navy blue to slate grey over the years. The kind of stitching that gets done in field conditions by someone who knows their way around a needle and thread. Because survival sometimes depends on keeping your kit together. Most tourists didn't notice it. Why would they? They were too busy marvelling at the pageantry, the precision, the sheer spectacle of British tradition in motion. Children giggled and waved at the guards, delighted by their statuesque stillness. Teenagers posed for selfies, trying to make the guards break character with silly faces and loud noises. But security detail, they notice everything. That morning, word had come down through proper channels that Lieutenant General Lionel Hawthorne would be making an unscheduled walkthrough. Nothing formal, just a quick inspection to ensure everything was up to standard, before some high-level diplomatic meetings later in the week. The kind of visit that makes everyone, from corporals to colonels, double-check their kit and straighten their already straight posture. Which is how Sergeant Miles Renton ended up standing in front of Granger with a clipboard and what he considered to be a serious problem. Renton was one of those Ministry of Defence inspection officers who took genuine pride in finding the things others missed. Mid-30s, perfectly pressed uniform that had never seen anything more challenging than Whitehall corridors, boots that had never known mud or blood or the weight of real consequence. The kind of man who believed with absolute certainty that if something wasn't explicitly written in the manual, it had no business being on a British soldier. He'd been walking the ceremonial line for 20 minutes, checking spacing between the guards, noting the angle of each rifle, ensuring every piece of brass gleamed exactly as regulation demanded. His clipboard was filled with tiny check marks and notations, the kind of thoroughness that impresses superiors and intimidates subordinates. Then he stopped, frowned, leaned in closer to Granger's sleeve. "What's that on your uniform?" Granger didn't respond, didn't even shift his eyes. Just stood there like a statue, the way he'd been trained to do for more years than Renton had been breathing in uniform. "I'm speaking to you, guardsman," Renton said, his voice carrying that particular edge of authority being tested. "That marking on your sleeve, where did it come from?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Tourists started to notice the confrontation. Phones coming up to record what they thought might be part of the elaborate ceremony they'd paid to see. A group of teenagers giggled nervously, unsure whether this was entertainment or something more serious. "Is this normal?" whispered a woman with a Yorkshire accent to her husband. "Should he be getting so close?" "Dunno," came the reply. "Maybe it's part of the show?" But the tension in the air suggested otherwise. Children stopped their excited chatter, sensing adult stress they couldn't understand. The usual flow of tourist conversation, the mix of languages and excited observations, began to quiet as more people noticed the standoff. Renton circled Granger slowly, studying the patch like it was evidence at a crime scene. His pen clicked repeatedly. A nervous habit he'd developed during his brief stint at officer training. The sound echoed off the palace stones, sharp and irritating in the morning quiet. "I asked you a direct question," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "That insignia isn't part of any authorised ceremonial dress code. As a serving member of Her Majesty's forces, you're required to explain any unauthorised modifications to your uniform." A businessman in an expensive suit paused on his way to work, sensing drama. A group of German tourists lowered their cameras, no longer sure what they were witnessing. The Australian veteran moved closer to the rope, his trained eye studying both men with growing interest. "This isn't right," murmured a young mother, pulling her toddler closer. "Something's not right about this." From the crowd, a woman whispered to her husband, "Why is that man bothering the guard?" Her young daughter tugged on her coat, confused by the tension in the air. "Not speaking to a superior officer," Renton's voice carried farther now, drawing more attention from the growing crowd. "That patch is unauthorised. It's a violation of Queen's regulations regarding ceremonial appearance. It needs to come off now." Granger's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. Not defiance, something deeper. something weathered, like a man who'd heard this kind of challenge before in places where paperwork mattered less than staying alive and knew exactly what it was worth. Renton made an elaborate show of writing notes on his clipboard, the scratching of his pen audible in the morning quiet. Right then, we'll see what your commanding officer has to say about this clear breach of protocol. He walked away, but not far. Just to the edge of the ceremonial area where he could make some calls and gather the backup he'd need to make his point stick. Because Sergeant Miles Renton was going to prove something here, even if it meant embarrassing a guard in front of 300 tourists with cameras. The tourists didn't disperse. Something about the confrontation had shifted the mood from casual sightseeing to something more serious. Parents pulled their children closer. The usual chatter died down to worried whispers. 20 minutes later, Renton was back. This time he wasn't alone. 2 junior inspection aides flanked him, young men in crisp uniforms who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Behind them walked a protocol officer whose entire job was ensuring that everything the public saw reflected proper military standards. They moved with the kind of bureaucratic confidence that comes from having regulations on your side and superiors watching. "Now then," Renton announced as they approached, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear every word. "Let's resolve this properly." He stepped up to Granger again, this time with witnesses and the full weight of official procedure behind him. "Right, Corporal. Last chance to explain that unauthorized marking. Either you tell me where it came from and why you're wearing it, or we'll have you off this post within the hour." The crowd had gotten noticeably quieter. This clearly wasn't part of the normal ceremony. Children stopped their excited chatter and pressed closer to their parents, sensing adult tension they couldn't understand. Phones were still recording, but the mood had shifted from entertainment to something more serious. "I know exactly what I'm looking at here," Renton announced, speaking as much to his aides as to Granger. "Unauthorized modification of ceremonial uniform, possible violation of multiple sections of Queen's regulations, the kind of breach that gets people dismissed from service with prejudice." One of the younger aides shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Renton and Granger. "Sir, perhaps we should follow proper procedure," Renton cut him off sharply. "That's what separates professional military service from amateur hour. Regulations exist for a reason, and sentiment doesn't trump standard." The protocol officer cleared his throat nervously, but said nothing. The second aide was studying his own clipboard with the intensity of someone trying to avoid eye contact. That's when Granger spoke. His voice low and steady, eyes never moving from their fixed point ahead. "You don't know what you're looking at, Sergeant." The words hit the morning air like a stone, dropping into still water. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolutely certain. Spoken with the kind of quiet authority that comes from places where rank matters less than experience and words carry the weight of consequence. Renton's face reddened. "I know exactly what I'm looking at. An old soldier who thinks his past service gives him the right to ignore current standards and make up his own rules. Some things," Granger said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "aren't written in your manual, Sergeant." "Everything that matters is in the manual," Renton snapped back, his composure starting to crack. "That's the entire point of having standardized procedures. Without them, we're just playing dress-up." The protocol officer cleared his throat more insistently. The aides were looking anywhere but at the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Even the tourists had gone completely silent, sensing something heavy in the air they couldn't quite understand, but knew was important. An elderly gentleman in the crowd, the kind who wore his remembrance poppy with quiet pride, leaned forward slightly. He'd been watching the exchange with increasing interest, his weathered eyes studying not just the confrontation but the man at its centre. Granger's voice came again, quieter now but somehow carrying further across the courtyard. "That patch wasn't sewn for show, Sergeant. Mind what you're stirring up." It wasn't a threat, wasn't even a warning, really, just the kind of statement that makes smart people pause and reconsider. The tone of someone who'd seen enough to know the difference between what looks important and what actually matters. But Renton was too committed to his position to back down now, too invested in being right to consider that he might be missing something crucial. "Right then," he said, making more aggressive notes on his clipboard, "we'll let your chain of command sort this out. But I'm recommending immediate disciplinary action. That patch comes off today, or you do." That's when they heard the car, the low, distinctive purr of an engine that costs more than most people make in a year, the crisp sound of expensive tyres on gravel. Every head in the crowd turned toward the palace gates as a black vehicle with government plates and tinted windows rolled to a quiet stop. Renton straightened his shoulders and adjusted his cap. This was it, his moment to demonstrate proper military discipline in action. The general would see the problem, approve the correction, and Renton would have done his job exactly by the book. A career-making moment of doing the right thing under pressure. The car door opened with that particular click that only comes from vehicles built to withstand explosions. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, immediately commanding attention from everyone within earshot. Out stepped Lieutenant General Lionel Hawthorne, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that makes rooms go quiet without him saying a word. His uniform was immaculate, but lived in, pressed to perfection, but showing the subtle signs of a man who'd worn uniforms in places where appearance mattered less than performance. There was something in his bearing that spoke of battles fought and won, of decisions made in darkness that kept others safe in daylight. The way he moved suggested joints that had been tested by more than just age, a body that had been pushed beyond normal limits and emerged stronger for it. The ribbon rack on his chest told stories that most soldiers only read about in history books. The Falklands Campaign ribbon with its distinctive blue and yellow stripes, the Northern Ireland medal with its orange edge. Operations that didn't make the headlines, but kept the world a little safer. Each decoration spoke of places where young men had grown old quickly, where theory met reality, and only the strongest survived. He walked the ceremonial line without hurry, but with purpose. His inspection wasn't the quick walkthrough of someone going through motions, but the careful observation of a man who understood that details matter and that the smallest things often reveal the most important truths. Each guard received the same measured attention, the same professional assessment. His eyes swept from boots to bearskin, noting posture, spacing, the angle of rifles, the polish of brass. But more than that, he was reading the men themselves. Their fitness, their confidence, their readiness. This wasn't just ceremony for him. This was evaluation of the people tasked with representing something larger than themselves. Until he reached Granger and stopped. He didn't look at the man's face. Not at first. His eyes went straight to that small, faded patch on the inner sleeve. The one that had caused all the trouble. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, the recognition of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. The silence that followed was different from ceremonial quiet. This was the kind of silence that comes when someone who truly understands finally finds what they've been expecting to see, but hoping they wouldn't. "Where did you get that?" the general asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, but tempered with something else, something that sounded almost like relief. Granger's response came without hesitation, though he still didn't move from his ceremonial position. "I didn't get it, sir. I kept it." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that the crowd couldn't grasp, but could feel. Like overhearing half of a conversation that explained everything and nothing at once. Renton stepped forward, sensing his moment. This was it. The vindication he'd been building toward. "General, if I may, this guardsman's appearance is currently under review. That patch represents a clear violation of ceremonial dress code and—" General Hawthorne turned slowly. The look he gave Renton could have frozen the Thames in July. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder and more final. The expression of someone who'd just heard a child interrupt a funeral. "You questioned this soldier about this patch." Renton blinked, suddenly uncertain. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was starting to crack around the edges. "Sir, yes. It's not regulation. It's not documented in any—" "Then shut your mouth and step back." The words hit like a physical blow. Renton's aides went rigid. The protocol officer dropped his pen, the small clatter echoing in the sudden quiet. Even the tourists seemed to feel the shift in atmospheric pressure, the way animals sense earthquakes before they hit. The general turned back to Granger and did something no one expected. He stepped forward, raised his hand, and with gentle precision, brushed 2 fingers along the edge of that faded patch. The gesture was almost reverent, like touching something sacred. "Where were you when the call came through?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched for Granger's ears alone, but carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard. Granger's voice was steady as bedrock. Still moving, sir. Still listening. Something passed between them then. A recognition that went deeper than rank or regulation or anything written in manuals. The kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience in places where the rules are written in blood and survival depends on trusting the people beside you. General nodded once, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. Then he did something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. He extended his hand. Not a salute, not a ceremonial gesture, just one soldier offering his hand to another in recognition of something that couldn't be expressed in words or captured in photographs. Granger took it without hesitation. They shook once, firmly, their eyes meeting for just a moment. Then they let go, and the connection was complete. The general turned back to Renton, who was standing there looking like a man who'd just realized he'd been arguing with the tide and expecting it to listen. "You weren't wrong to ask, Sergeant," the general said, his voice softer now, but carrying the kind of finality that ends discussions permanently. "Questions are part of your job, but you were wrong to assume that everything important can be found in a manual." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Renton could hear clearly. "That patch isn't unauthorized. It's unspeakable. That man earned it in places your clearance doesn't cover, doing things that kept people like you safe enough to worry about uniform regulations." The general paused, letting that sink in. "He wore it before you had your first uniform fitting, before you knew the difference between ceremony and service, before you learned that some honors aren't meant for display." He looked back at Granger, then at the crowd of tourists who had witnessed the entire exchange without understanding a single word of its deeper meaning. "Thank you for your patience," he said to them, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Then he walked back to his car, got in, and drove away without another word. The silence that followed was absolute. Renton stood frozen for several long seconds, his clipboard hanging uselessly at his side, like a prop from a play that had suddenly changed scripts. The aides looked at each other, then at him, then at Granger, trying to process what they'd just witnessed and understand how everything had shifted so completely in the space of 5 minutes. One of the MOD security officers who'd been watching from a distance approached quietly. "No paperwork on this one," he murmured to Renton. "General's direct orders. Files closed." Renton just nodded, his throat too tight for words. What else could he do? He'd walked onto what he thought was solid ground and discovered it was quicksand. Everything he'd thought he understood about authority and procedure had just been revealed as surface-level knowledge in a world with depths he'd never imagined. From the crowd, a child's voice cut through the quiet like a bell. "Is he important, Daddy?" Her father looked at Granger, still standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on that invisible point ahead, the mysterious patch once again hidden in the shadows of his sleeve, but somehow more present than ever. "Yes, sweetheart," the father said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of respect usually reserved for monuments and memorials. "I think he's very important." The tourists didn't leave. Not right away. They stood there, phones lowered and forgotten, trying to understand what they'd witnessed. They'd come expecting pageantry and gotten something much more real, much more human, something that connected them to history in a way no museum, exhibit or textbook ever could. The businessman who'd stopped to watch was still there, his morning commute forgotten. The German tourists huddled together, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd seen. The Australian veteran stood straighter now, his own military bearing unconsciously coming to attention in recognition of something he understood better than most. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes stepped closer to the rope barrier. She'd been watching the whole time, with the intensity of someone who recognized something important was happening, even if she couldn't name what it was. "He's not like the others," she said to her companion, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize the difference between performance and presence. "He's carrying something they're not." Her friend, a younger woman with that particular London accent that speaks of generations rooted in the city, asked, "What do you think that patch means?" The older woman didn't answer right away. She just watched Granger standing there, not performing for the crowd, not posing for pictures, just being present in a way that suggested depths no one could fathom and weights no one else could carry. "Some stories," she finally said, her voice soft but certain, "aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be remembered, and some people are chosen to do the remembering." As the morning wore on, other guards were rotated in and out according to the precise schedule that governs such things. Fresh faces replaced tired ones, but Granger remained constant. The tourists changed, the light shifted, the shadows moved across the ancient courtyard stones. But he stayed fixed, like a lighthouse in rough seas, unchanged by the chaos around him. The young guards who passed him during their rotations looked at him differently now. Not because anything had changed about him. He was exactly the same as he'd always been, but because they'd seen what happened when someone who really understood tried to read the weight he carried in that faded patch and the respect it commanded from those who mattered. Renton eventually walked away, not in anger or embarrassment, but with the careful steps of someone who'd learned something important about the difference between following rules and understanding their purpose. He'd go home that night and stare at his own reflection for a long time, wondering how many other things he'd missed in his determination to measure everything against his clipboard. And as the afternoon sun found its way through London's perpetual grey clouds, it caught that small patch one more time. The thread glinted like old brass. Not bright enough to draw attention from those who didn't know to look, but present enough to remind anyone who understood that some things are more important than the manuals that try to contain them. The crowd gradually thinned as the day wore on, but many of the tourists who'd witnessed the morning's events stayed longer than they'd planned. They weren't watching for movement anymore. They knew the guards wouldn't move. They were watching for something else, and something they couldn't name, but could feel in the quiet dignity of the man who stood apart. They were watching history stand at attention. They were watching a man who'd sewn his service into his sleeve and carried it with the kind of quiet dignity that no inspection could evaluate, no regulation could improve, and no amount of bureaucratic authority could diminish. And in the end, that was worth more than all the perfect brass and polished leather in the world. Would you have questioned the patch, or trusted the man who wore it like it wasn't meant for display? What do you think that insignia represented? A classified operation that saved lives, a unit that officially never existed, or something too heavy for words to carry? If this story reminded you that real strength doesn't announce itself, smash that like button and subscribe for daily stories that show what honor really looks like when no one's keeping score. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the most important badges are the ones nobody's supposed to see, and the deepest respect is earned in whispers, not shouts. The next story is waiting on screen right now. Another moment when silence spoke louder than any words ever could. I'll see you tomorrow. Same time, with another reminder that true authority doesn't come from manuals or clipboards, but from the weight of things that can't be written down, but must never be forgotten. Must never be forgotten. Must never be forgotten. Must never be forgotten.